Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce the first in our Law and Race series this year. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Dr. Kirsty Hughes. I'm an Associate Professor in Human Rights Law and the Director for the Centre of Public Law. And together with Vandita Khanna, I'm the co-convener of this series. The intention behind the series is to provide a forum for considering the complex relationship between law and race, encompassing both the achievements and possibilities of law in striving for equality and justice, but also its limitations, systemic failings, and culpability. We hope that this series will shed light on different aspects of the legal framework and will amplify different voices within that framework. And we're seeking to bring together, amongst others, students, academics, practitioners, and NGOs. And in this regard, I was particularly struck by a passage in our speaker's book this evening, in which he reflects upon the realization that law school had not prepared him for addressing the needs of grieving families. And I hope that through this series, we might be able to strive to provide a slightly more rounded understanding of the complexities of the legal world and prepare you to understand your role and responsibilities within it. We also want the series to be a forum for community building. And so we will endeavour within what is a very, very limited budget to try to facilitate social events as well. So do come to the drinks afterwards, do chat with us. We're keen to develop new things, we're interested in your ideas, so just let us know. Okay, I'm about to hand over to Vandita, who's going to introduce our speaker. But before I do, I want to express my thanks to Vandita, all the work that she's put into the series. Vandita is an outstanding scholar. She's producing brilliant work on racialized poverty. She's looking embarrassed, but she's great. One of the great privileges of my job is engaging with her work and learning from her. And I hope that this forum will provide a similar environment for all of us. Okay, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kirsty. And thank you to all of you for being here today. It's something new that we're trying, and it will be a continuous process for all of us to learn. So it's very encouraging to see so many people here who seem to be interested in the idea of understanding better the relationship between law and race. As our first speaker for this term, as well as for the academic year, we are both pleased to have with us Professor Leslie Thomas, King's Counsel. Professor Thomas is a human rights and civil liberties barrister, as well as the former joint head of Garden Court Chambers. He has appeared in several high-profile cases representing the families of the deceased. These include the Birmingham Pub Bombing Inquests, the Grenfell Inquiry, Azelle Rodney, Mark Duggan, Christopher Alder, as well as Sean Rigg, among several others. In recognition of his work in 2012, Professor Thomas was awarded the Legal Aid Barrister of the Year, and again in 2016 for his work on the Hillsborough disaster. In 2020, he received the award for Outstanding Contribution to Diversity and Inclusion in the UK Chambers Bar Awards. In 2020, he became the first Black Professor of Law at Gresham College, and he also holds the visiting Professor of Law position at Goldsmiths University. Professor Thomas also sits on the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Subcommittee for the Inner Temple and the Bar Standards Board Race Equality Task Force. Given his impressive body of work over the years, I was personally delighted to find that he is also the author of Do Right and Fear No One, A Life Dedicated to Fighting for Justice, which is his autobiography published earlier this year. Today, Leslie has kindly agreed to speak to us on discrimination, disproportionality, and Black deaths in custody, which seems more timely than ever. His talk will last for approximately half an hour, following which we will moderate questions from the audience. And finally, as a last housekeeping matter, just to let you know, the first part of the event, that is Leslie's talk and not the discussion that follows, is being recorded. Thank you once again for being a part of this new journey for all of us. And with that, I would like Leslie to take the floor.
Clarence Jameson wasn't jaywalking. No, that was Michael Brown. He wasn't playing outside with a toy gun. That was 12-year-old Tamar Rice. He didn't look like a suspicious person. That was Elijah McClain. He wasn't suspected of selling loose cigarettes. That was Eric Gardner. He wasn't suspected of passing a $20 counterfeit bill. That was George Floyd. He didn't look like anyone suspected of a crime. That was Philando Castile and Tony McDade. He wasn't in need of help. That was Jason Harrison. He wasn't assisting an autistic person who had wandered away from a group home. That was Charles Kinsey. He wasn't walking home from an after-school job. That was 17-year-old James Earl Green. He wasn't walking back from a restaurant. That was Ben Brown. He wasn't hanging out on a college campus. That was Philip Gibbs. He wasn't standing outside his own apartment. That was Amadou Diallo. He wasn't inside his apartment eating ice cream. That was Botham John. He wasn't sleeping in his own bed. That was Breonna Taylor. He wasn't sleeping in his car. That was Rayshard Brooks. He didn't make an improper lane change. That was Sandra Bland. He didn't have a broken tail light. That was Walter Scott. He wasn't driving over the speed limit. That was Hannah Pfizer. He wasn't driving under the speed limit. That was Ace Perry. No, Clarence Jameson was a black man driving a Mercedes convertible. Thankfully, Jameson left the stop with his life. Too many others have not. These were the first 20 lines of US District Judge Carlton W. Reeves in August 2020 in a case called Jameson against McLennan regarding qualified immunity of the police to certain claims of wrongdoing. An interesting side note, Judge Reeves is black. It was Martin Luther King Jr. who said, "Courtesy asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But the conscience asks the question, is it right? And there comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but takes it because the conscience tells us it is right." Now, some may not like what I'm about to say, but I say it not because it's safe, not because it's popular or politic, but because my conscience tells me to do so. I can be silent no more. As Elijah Lawal said in his book, The Clapback, it is tiring to always have to push back against the notice that we are somehow lesser, to constantly have to justify our existence, our entitlement to basic civil rights, and the need for equality. Firstly, before I can get into this talk, we have to be appreciative and have some understanding that our history and our system of laws defended a tyrannical empire for many hundreds of years in which human trafficking, enslavement of people, rape, and the murder of an entire race of people based on skin colour was lawful and justified. So, when the question is posed, can those of us who dispense justice or are somehow involved in the business of justice be immune from racism? I would like to shout, of course not! But despite the fact I believe the answer to be obvious, there are still so many of us, some undoubtedly sitting amongst us today, who require convincing or believe that these matters are just in the past. But ask yourself this: when does the present become the past? During my lifetime education career, we've had the SOS laws, we've had a government who refused to go out and rightly condemn a racist apartheid system and sought to encourage trade with South Africa. You see, history will come back and reveal the truth. And history isn't always pretty or flattering. I wonder what it's going to be like in 20 years from now, 30 years from now, when we look back and we consider how we treat refugees in this country. As the late Colin Bob Semple wrote in his book, Race, Jail versus Bail, quote, "Throughout the British plantation system, it was customary for the planters to become magistrates. They were the people responsible for the constant whipping and other forms of torture of enslaved Africans, in addition to performing their roles as justices. And after emancipation, the planters continued to act as magistrates and dispense justice, sometimes very harshly." Let's look at negative perceptions of black people. You see, I believe it's important to understand some of the historical reasons for the differential treatment of black people and why that might continue to this day. In Akala's Natives, he states, quote, "Both black and white children generally understand from a very early age that blackness is a synonym for bad and whiteness is synonymous with wealth, power, and beauty. For black children in Britain, our bodies commit the sin of reminding people racialized as white of an uncomfortable truth about how this nation became wealthy, and that the good old days when white power could roam the earth unchallenged is over. They now have to contend with one of their empire's many legacies, a multi-ethnic mother country." We see this today with the white supremacists espousing the great replacement theory, that somehow our existence of people of colour is somehow a threat to white people, leading to white supremacists perpetrating horrible crimes such as the 2019 Christchurch mosque shootings, the 2019 El Paso shooting, and the May 2022 Buffalo shooting in a supermarket, killing so many elderly African Americans. Even today, in 2022, we still have images for these racist views today. Men of African heritage in their encounters with the police are often described as powerful, with superhuman strength, needing several police officers to help restrain them. Don't take my word for it. See the evidence given in Sheku Bayo's inquiry in Scotland, or the Andrew Hall inquest, or Kevin Clark, all black men who were not seen as men, but as strong animals, monsters in need of restraint. There has been a real discussion about race in the public discourse following the horrific killing of an unarmed black man whose death was captured on video. And we see him dying before our very eyes, calling out for his dead mama. This has led us to question race, concepts of discrimination, racism, how we can be anti-racist and live in truly anti-racist ways. You see, discrimination and racism behaviours pervades all levels of our society, and the legal system is not immune from the same. Let's turn and let's take a look at who dispenses justice: judges. As I said in a recent Gresham lecture, and by the way, if you haven't seen my Gresham lectures, you can see them all on Catch Up. Just Google Leslie Thomas, Gresham College, where I talk about judges. Judges are some of the most powerful actors in our society. The decisions they take can often be life-changing for individuals, communities, and society as a whole. At some point in your life, a judge may have to decide whether you go to prison, or a judge may have to decide whether you lose your home, whether you lose benefits or lose custody of your children. A good judge can transform lives for the better. A bad judge can ruin lives irreparably. The judiciary is an institution. All institutions have ingrained patterns and behaviours, often, but not always, unconscious. And as an institution, the judiciary can be racist. The concept of institutional racism was first coined in 1967 by Carmichael and Hamilton, when they said, "Racism is both overt and covert. It takes two closely related forms: individual whites acting against individual blacks, and the acts by a total white community against the black community. We call these individual racism and institutional racism. The first consists of overt acts by individuals which cause death, injury, or the violent destruction of property. This type can be recorded by television cameras. It can frequently be observed in the process of commission. The second type is less overt, far more subtle, less identifiable in terms of specific individuals committing the acts, but it is no less destructive of human life. The second type originates in the operation of established and respected forces in the society, and thus receives far less public condemnation than the first type. Judicial racism is as much about history as it is about law. as Bob Semple says. Judicial racism in the criminal courts is pronounced when looking at sentencing practices. The government's 2017 report by David Lammy, MP, comprehensively lay bare this truth, reporting the results of a 2016 Ministry of Justice review of Crown Court sentencing practices for 3 groups of offences. Offences involving violence, sexual offences, and drug offences. This review found, and I quote, under similar criminal circumstances, the odds of imprisonment for offenders from self-reported Black, Asian, and Chinese or other backgrounds were higher than for offenders from self-reported white backgrounds. Starkly, it found that within drug offences, the odds of receiving a prison sentence for Black offenders, does anyone want to have a hazard a guess at the percentage higher? Go on, have a go. So what was that, 80? Try again.
200.
Close. 240% higher. Yes, you heard me right. 240% higher for receiving a harsher sentence for comparable offences if you are Black. Let that sink in. And my friends, this isn't an opinion, this is counting. The systemic inequality and biases in the legal profession is reflected in the makeup of our judiciary. Nationally, only 1% of judges are Black, while 5% are Asian and 2% are mixed race. And there is a big difference between the junior and senior judiciary. While the junior judiciary is slowly diversifying, and I stress slowly, the senior judiciary is not, and remains overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly from privileged backgrounds. In fact, there are currently no Black judges in the High Court, Court of Appeal, or Supreme Court. Not one. As Judge Peter Herbert said, the judiciary is probably one of the last bastions of the British establishment, adding, racism is alive and well and living in Tower Hamlets, in Westminster, and yes, sometimes in the judiciary. When we stop and we look at the hard data presented in this work, society can no longer pretend, judges can no longer hide, and those who seek to preserve the status quo cannot plead ignorance. Change is coming, and that is for the good of all. Now, everybody knows about overt racism. Akala summed it up right when he said this: despite much seeming and some very real progress, public discourse about racism is still as childish and supine as it ever was. Where do we discuss race in public? We seem to have been trained to see racism, if we see it at all, as an issue of interpersonal morality. Good people are not racist, only bad people are. This neat binary is a great way of avoiding any real discussion on the subject. Peggy McIntosh once said, quote, "I did not see myself as a racist because I was taught to recognise racism only in individual acts of meanness by members of my group, never in invisible systems conferring unsought racial dominance on my group from the moment of my birth." As Sir William Macpherson said in the report on the death of Stephen Lawrence, there is a dangerous, insidious form of racism. It persists because of the failure of organisations openly and adequately to recognise and address its existence and the causes by policy, example, and leadership. Without recognition and action to eliminate such racism, it can prevail as part of the ethos or culture of the organisation. It is a corrosive disease. So, some harsh realities have to be confronted. Firstly, to discuss diversity and improving diversity, particularly when it concerns the issue of race, there needs to be a proper, honest discussion about racism. We have to move beyond discussing or seeing racism as individual characteristics. We need to understand racism as a system, not an event. None of us are exempt from its forces. Racism impacts differently on different groups. I often ask myself why discussion on racism is such a difficult subject. Again, back to Peggy McIntosh, who noted, "It seems obvious to me that the obliviousness about white advantage is like the obliviousness to male advantage is kept strongly, and in our society we maintain the myth of meritocracy, the myth that democratic choice is equally available to all, keeping most people unaware that freedom of confident action is there for just a small number of people, props up those in power, and serves to keep power in the hands of the same groups that have most of it already." There's a lot of guilt and heads being placed in the sand over the fact that the white majority ethnic group in our society have a distinct advantage over those racialized as minority groups because of the concepts such as privilege, bias, and blatant unwarranted discrimination. A lot of time in recent years has been focused on the elimination of discrimination, often referred to as direct discrimination, and attempts at trying to tackle indirect discrimination, but often this type of discrimination is more, as I say, insidious and difficult to establish. As far back as 1988, McIntosh wrote, "I was taught to think that racism could end if white individuals changed their attitude. But a white skin opens many doors for whites, whether or not we approve of the dominance that has been conferred on us." As Professor Ibram X. Kendi wrote, "It's a flawed and outdated view on racism to believe that the racist is an individual who consciously does not like people based on race and is intentionally mean to them. Such a definition is a deflection which protects the system. When our profession recognises that racism doesn't necessarily come from individuals, doesn't need to be conscious, doesn't need to be intentional, we will be moving in the right direction. Racial injustice and racism isn't a simple binary question. The racist needn't be bad, ignorant, bigoted, prejudiced, or old. the non-racist, isn't necessarily the good person, educated, progressive, open-minded or fair, well-intended or young. The discussion goes way beyond this. And, my friends, if you believe the system is colourblind and treats everyone the same, then you are the one with the problem. Colourblindness does not work in a system where everyone at the top is white. Everyone in the best work is white. And the two best universities have a distinct lack of black people. And the top public schools are predominantly white. You see, if you're a person of colour, just seeing this would set alarm bells off. Where I come from, we would say, don't take me for a mug. If you recognise that systems and structures were designed to disadvantage and marginalise groups, the expectation then be that the dominant group use their access, privilege and opportunity to make way for those without the same access, privilege and opportunity. McIntosh points out, I think that whites are carefully taught not to recognise white privilege, as males are taught not to recognise male privilege. So I have begun, in an untutored way, to ask, what is it like to have white privilege? I have come to see that white privilege as an invisible package of unearned assets that I can count on cashing in each day, but without which I was meant to remain oblivious. White privilege is like an invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions, maps, passports, code books, visas, clothes, tools, and blank cheques. What exactly is white privilege? The reality that a white person's whiteness has come and continues to come with an array of benefits, advantages not shared by people of colour. It doesn't mean that I, as a white person, don't work hard. I do. Or that I haven't suffered. Well, I've known struggle. But simply that I receive help, often unacknowledged, assistance because I am white. That's a quote from John Greenberg. Greenberg gives 10 examples of white privilege, including having the privilege of being favoured by educational authorities, attending the best schools of affluence, learning about your race in school, finding children's books that overwhelmingly represent your race, soaking in the media blatantly biased towards your race, escaping violent stereotypes associated with your race, playing the colourblind card, wiping the slate clean of centuries of racism, being insulated from the daily toll of racism, living in ignorant bliss of the dire state of racism today. I don't know anything about that. So where can we go? What can we do? And why should we do anything about it? Should we care? New Zealand lawyer and mediator Paul Sills provides the why. He argues, 1, diversity is important because it's beneficial to have individuals with various talents, whether in a group, company or social setting, the variety argument. Secondly, diversity encourages individuals to embrace some of the qualities of humanism, not necessarily as a religious or philosophical policy, but rather as a way of relating to others. the understanding of each other argument. Thirdly, by learning about and understanding different traditions of a friend, say at work or in school, we can become more sensitive to those traditions, the sensitivity argument. Fourthly, you cannot solve a problem from the same level of thinking that created it, Einstein. Different backgrounds and cultures approach conflict in different ways. People with diverse backgrounds can provide insight on new approaches to address difficult moral and other dilemmas. The enhanced creativity argument. Fifthly, diversity educates us all. The educational argument. Sixthly, productivity flourishes in culturally diverse settings. The mind expands when it encounters modes of thinking that differ from our own. Diversity provides innovation, which in turn propels economic growth. Perhaps our present government ought to take a leaf out of that book. The innovation argument. And seventhly, diversity through globalization has brought into the world's most cosmopolitan cities tangible benefits, from personal development to enriching communities and the economy as a whole. Diversity thus acts as a magnet for talent, which in turn further spurs economic growth, the economic growth argument. Sills concludes, people who have grown up in multicultural societies often find it not only normal but desirable to live with people of different backgrounds. Diversity is not merely tolerated, but it's something that is actively sought out. Sills' arguments are powerful and persuasive, and I believe we all have to embrace these arguments. And it's our job to acknowledge and present these arguments persuasively and convincingly in an anti-racist way. Let me turn to hope. Can we achieve equity and equality among people? It's not going to be easy, is it? But Baldwin wrote, "Those who say it can't be done are usually interrupted by those doing it. Remember, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced."